So it's not that uncommon for British officials to argue that excessive acts of violence are almost like a kind of discipline that you can use to punish inhumanity.
What's going on, everyone? I'm Ramblings of a Sikh and welcome back to our channel. If you are new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more insightful discussions, intriguing interviews and thought-provoking podcasts. Have you ever wondered how a single company managed to control an entire subcontinent? Today we're diving deep into the hidden tactics and strategies of the East India Company. With Callie Wilkinson as our expert guide, we'll journey into a world of intrigue, power and influence.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, you've had some amazing historians on this podcast, so it's just an honor to be included.
From using notions of humanity and inhumanity as pretext for violence and conquest to employing intricate surveillance systems, will dive deep into the East India Company's myriad insidious strategies and complex relationships. Callie, before we navigate this historical expanse, what drove you to explore the intricate dynamics of the East India Company's indirect rule in India?
Yeah, so maybe a good place to start is to say people can probably tell from my accent that I'm actually not British, I'm Canadian. But I think growing up in a British settler colony, I always really felt like the history of the British Empire was also my history, that it was something that I had a responsibility to grapple with and to think about, especially in terms of its darker side. And like a lot of historians, that then drew me to the East India Company because the company developed so many of these tactics of imperial rule that would later be applied in other parts of the world. So, maybe as a historian of the East India Company, I have to view it this way. But for me, I think that to understand empire, you really do have to understand the East India Company, or at least it helps. And when it comes to the idea and practice of indirect rule, that in particular was a really important part of the company's legacy that would then reverberate across Asia and Africa and the Indian Ocean world. So that's why I really think that indirect rule under the East India Company was worth studying. But in some ways, in retrospect, it was a little naive of me because it actually was a really complex topic, which I think we'll get into it in the interview. It will become apparent how diverse and difficult this history really is, although that's also part of the attraction in a way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm sure everyone enjoys a good challenge, and it definitely, I can imagine going through a lot of the archive and the research work for this, that you came across a hell of a lot of information that you were then trying to kind of like sift through and figure out how does this all actually connect and what's actually going on.
Well, yeah, in a way, it's funny that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that the book is quite short, and that was sort of purposeful because I think that when speaking about indirect rule, it is really easy to get into the kind of fine political details of factionalism at core to the political narratives. And what I wanted to do was to write a book that would just take out the important stuff and make it easy for people to grapple with what I thought was really significant. So in some ways, it's embarrassing to have such a short book, but I hope it means that people will actually read it.
Well, I think the key is that although it's short, it's extremely condensed in the sense of I would rather so for me reading that was brilliant because first of all you don't have to spend like 15 weeks trying to just finish it, but secondly when you came to the end of it you were like, God, like I've learned so much, as in it was a very compact, quick kind of understanding of the topics rather than having to sift through like loads of examples and anecdotes and whatever. So that's also partly the attraction for then why I thought, hold on, if this is, because there must be so much more that you could or didn't include in the book. So it's always interesting to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Just then discussing British understandings of India, and this is obviously kind of before, during, and I guess after as well, during kind of this whole process. How does the rule of conquest and the perception of brutality as kind of seen in stories about the Black Hole of Calcutta or Tipu Sultan's treatment of British captives, and equally I'm sure there's loads of other examples that people listening and others can probably think of. But how do they then contribute to the British understandings of India and then also help, I guess, legitimize the idea of indirect rule, just I guess per se?
Yeah, but especially rule by force and through conquest, for sure. Yeah, so the British definitely have this idea, as you said, as India as a land of conquest. They tend to imagine India as a really violent space. And there's a few reasons for this. In part, it's because of the Indian resistance that they met with as they tried to expand. So you mentioned Tipu Sultan and the Black Hole of Calcutta. I mean, this is just violent opposition that they encountered as they attempted to impose their influence. And these stories would become really embedded within British popular memory, and they would be used as a justification for acts of violence, almost in a sense of tit for tat. So, they were guilty of certain acts of injustice towards us, and therefore that justifies us in whatever we might do to them. But on top of that as well, it also has to do with this larger idea of Indian history that the British have, where they sort of narrate Indian history as this series of invasions. First the Mughals, and then the Marathas kind of expanding their sphere of influence in the 18th century. And then the British themselves, they actually see themselves as part of this history of empires and conquest. So because of this history, it's really common for British officials to argue that the only way to impose their influence is through force, essentially, that there needs to be the threat of force in order for them to maintain control. And that's applied in British India, that's applied in territories directly controlled by the company. But interestingly, it's also applied by the residents as well. And that's interesting to me because really they're supposed to be diplomats. They're supposed to be maintaining the peace, ideally avoiding violence. But to them, the best way to avoid violence is by kind of holding themselves the threat of violence that they can then use against these courts. And part of how they do that is actually stationing armed forces in the vicinity of Indian capitals. Ostensibly, these armed forces are being paid for by the company's allies. So actually, they're not meant to be serving the company. They're meant to be serving Indian rulers. That's what they're there to do. But it's one of the cruel ironies of this system of indirect rule that actually the loyalty of the army is to the company. And so these armies can be used against the rulers that they're meant to serve. And that's a really important part of how rulers are made compliant. And that's a really important part of how indirect rule in India operates.
How do concepts of humanity, inhumanity tie into this? And then equally, like, I don't know whether I'm just connecting dots in my head, but then how do things like martial race theory also connect? Because it almost seems as though the British are classifying, and this is obviously a recurring theme within British imperialism or imperialism per se, which is they just kind of turn up and they just start categorizing everybody into kind of whatever structures. So how does that feed into what's happening during the kind of the period that you were looking at?
Yeah, 100%. So first to deal with humanity and inhumanity, and then I'll get to the martial races, which is a really interesting aspect of this. So I think in the present day, we tend to see our common humanity as something that unites us, something that means we should all treat each other as we ourselves would want to be treated. We associate humanity with sort of positive interactions. But in the period that I'm writing about, humanity was conceived of somewhat differently in that actually not everyone was seen to belong to that category. It was actually an exclusionary category. Some people could claim to be behaving in human ways. Other people were inhuman. And that's because humanity was actually associated, particularly in the British mindset, with particular rules of conduct, a particular way of behaving. And if you breached those codes, which of course the British themselves defined, then you were guilty of inhumanity. And if you were guilty of inhumanity, then the so-called laws of nature, these rules of conduct that were supposed to apply anywhere in the world, if you were guilty of inhumanity, then those rules were not seen to apply to you. You could not claim the kinds of protections that came with those laws. And so again, what you see is this horrible paradox, and there's so many of these paradoxes associated with indirect rule, where supposedly inhuman behavior by other people was seen as almost giving the British permission to be inhuman themselves. So it's not that uncommon for British officials to argue that excessive acts of violence are almost like a kind of discipline that you can use to punish inhumanity. And so in a sense then, for them, violence can almost be a civilizing force, like a form of instruction. So ideas of humanity and inhumanity become a really important justification and a language that's used to talk about intervention, especially military intervention, but other kinds of political intervention as well. And martial races kind of comes into this because not all Indian courts and kingdoms are perceived in the same way. There are particular stereotypes associated with different courts that are seen to require different forms of conduct. So as we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little bit later, many of the Muslim courts, these successor states that had broken off from the Mughals, they were seen as courts that were maybe like quite luxurious, where appearance and display was especially important. But at the Maratha courts, the Marathas tended to be seen very differently. In some ways, they were almost admired by the British. They were seen as sort of plain, very rugged, strong, manly, but they were also seen as being particularly susceptible to inhumanity, mostly just because the way that they fought wars wasn't that similar to how the British fought. But they fought wars very effectively. So they aren't sort of conceived as a martial race in the same way that, like, for example, Sikhs later would be, but they're still seen as especially warlike people. And when you're dealing with a warlike people, there's an argument that you need to meet force with force. So with the Marathas in particular, they're much more prone to think, okay, the threat of violence needs to be particularly clear here, in a way that doesn't necessarily apply to some of the Muslim courts, though I think there's some degree of consistency. It's just a spectrum, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just discussing kind of this indirect rule and kind of some of the strategies that the East India Company deploys, kind of what are they and how do they change over time? Like, as in, you've just discussed kind of how even just perceptions of some of the courts differ. But then how do kind of the strategies differ, and like, do they change, or is it just a constant kind of threat or of violence, or is it a kind of a particular strategy that's deployed?
Yeah, so it does change quite a lot, but in typical historian speak, I'll say it changes, but it remains the same. To start with, so when these alliances are first developed, I wouldn't immediately classify them as a form of indirect rule, because at first, when the companies start concluding what are still unequal alliances, but when they start concluding these alliances in the late 18th century, their main motivation is actually financial. So it's pretty simple. The company are offering military protection, and in return, they're receiving subsidies or the lease of land. So in effect, what you're seeing is like protection money. And really, the company's primary concern is just to collect that money. So they'll intervene only insofar as it comes to getting the money that they need and want to maintain their armies. And that would always remain a high priority. These financial incentives would always be there. But over time, the political motivations start to move into the ascendant. And actually, the alliances start to be seen, more importantly, as a way to divide and conquer. And so in the book, this is really what I focus on at the turn of the 19th century. The companies start concluding these alliances where there are important clauses in the treaty that actually prevent Indian rulers from even like communicating with anyone except for the company. So the company takes over their foreign policy, essentially. And the reason why this is seen to be important is because for the company, it's not so much about controlling individual courts, although that's important, but at this point, their aspiration is really to control the whole political landscape of India. And how you do that is to try to isolate different states from one another to prevent them from forming hostile coalitions. Because if they can't combine together, then they can't really be an effective threat against the company. So that becomes sort of the primary motivation, and that remains a really important part of how the system works. Where things change a little bit is in terms of the scope of intervention. So at first, the company's idea is like, okay, we'll take control of foreign policy, but your internal administration, that's up to you. So long as we're getting our subsidies and so long as we're getting paid, then whatever you do, that's your business. But this is controversial, actually. I mean, not everyone agrees with this. Some people argue that the company has a responsibility to intervene, often simply to make sure that they're getting the money that they're owed. but also sometimes for these humanitarian reasons that we've been talking about, these ideas of like the inhumanity of Indian rulers. So it's interesting, when I describe the company's policy on this issue, I tend to use the metaphor of like a pendulum swing, because across the 19th century is just back and forth and back and forth between really heavy and direct intervention and a policy of non-intervention. And so they'll try one and it won't work. And so they'll try the other, and then there will be a regime change, and then they'll move back. And, they're never really able to find the right balance. And that's largely because the system is just rotten at its core. These relationships, they have a really corrosive effect on these kingdoms because they're draining wealth, but also because they're creating a sort of repressive political environment at court, just more generally. So under conditions like that, it's really difficult for Indian kingdoms to thrive. They tend to struggle politically and economically. That creates incentives for intervention. But then company officials, they're also not very good at governing these kingdoms. And there's a bunch of really embarrassing corruption scandals throughout the period. So that doesn't work, so they withdraw. That being said, although there are these changes that occur across the period, there are some things that remain the same. So although people might debate, okay, how much should we intervene? In what ways should we intervene? They never actually question the fact that they have a right to intervene. And that's what I see as paramountcy. And that's really the idea that I'm interested in tracing in my book. So although there are all these changes across the 19th century, the book really tends to focus on the early 19th century, because that's when this sense of entitlement really tends to emerge. And that would remain the same like into the 20th century.
There's so many questions that I want to ask off the back of just that short little answer you've given. But just focusing on how, on something that got my interest, because I had the pleasure to talk to Julia May Crusoe, who wrote a book about how the Middle East was invented. And what was interesting in that conversation was she spoke about how essentially India was almost like a testing ground for certain strategies and certain kind of ways of I guess almost like a petri dish for imperialism. And similarly, I saw that come up in your book. So I just wanted to get an idea of like, how do East India Company's practices of indirect rule in India then influence how British colonial strategies just generally are working per se across the empire?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I would say that they do have a really clear influence. They're often cited explicitly as a model for how indirect rule would be introduced elsewhere. What's more, a lot of agents of indirect rule in other parts of the empire actually got their first kind of work experience, I guess you could say, in India. So they're training in India, they're learning this style of Indian rule, and they're bringing that with them to other parts of the empire, to Asia and Africa. So in that sense, I think there is a really clear influence that's being drawn. But it's important to note, perhaps, that is very much a pattern that emerges later in the 19th century. When this system of indirect rule first starts emerging in India in the early 19th century, it's not that obvious to people that it's going to be a success, and it's not really that clear to them that actually this is something that should be exported to different parts of the empire. So an interesting example for me is that in 1815, Stamford Raffles, the founder of Singapore, he reached out to the company and he was like, look, we should extend this system into Southeast Asia. Let's have these subsidiary alliances all across the region. And actually, the court of directors in London reject the plan because in their mind, the alliance system has already stretched too far and the company is too politically entangled and it's not working. And even in the Gulf, they do have a similar system that's created there like in the 1820s, but it's not immediately obvious to them that actually they should be replicating what people are doing in India. They're trying to avoid what they see as the mistakes that were being made in South Asia at the time. So I think this is a really good example of how we need to make sure that we're not projecting our ideas onto the past or taking for granted how things would turn out. Because in the end, with retrospect, we know that indirect rule would become really important. But to people at the time, it was not so clear that this is what should happen. We tend to think of indirect rule like the scholarly convention is that it's easier, it's less expensive, it's less disruptive, it requires less manpower. But it created all kinds of problems for people. And those are really the problems that I wanted to emphasize in the book, to show that there's actually a really interesting history to be told that isn't just simply the British come and impose control.
Definitely. I think that was something that was really really made clear with when I had the pleasure to talk to Nandini Das, because her book, I've forgotten the name now and really bad at me, but again, it explores how essentially the British turn up in India and they're almost like a footnote in the Mughal Empire at the time's kind of records. And you are correct in that we almost assume the British were always going to end up ruling in the way they ruled, and that's obviously further from the truth than I guess the general perception says. Just then looking at some of the challenges the East India Company faces, like both practically and I guess ideologically, because dealing with so many, well, first of all, India is massive, but then secondly, there's just so many different cultures, religions, philosophies, understandings, and I know everyone listening to this is probably thinking, yeah, well, they also classify us to the nth degree, but how are they being challenged and how do they navigate that? Because in some regards, like, so the little information that I'm aware of is like with Ranjit Singh's Punjab, they essentially just wait until the point that they kind of think it's correct. So they liaise with some of the kind of the royalty of Punjab at the time, and then essentially make an excuse, go to war, annex Punjab, and hey, everyone's a winner. Like, and I guess up until that point, the only reason why they'd been kept at bay was because of diplomacy. By Ranjit Singh and kind of creating treaties with them just to keep them at a border's length. But at the same time, other royal households in Punjab sided with the British in order to keep their own sovereignty, but also to ensure in some ways that Ranjit didn't engulf them. And I guess that also goes to show how the British weren't inevitably going to always be the victors. But yeah, what other kind of practical, ideological kind of challenges do the British face, and how do they get around them?
Yeah, so that raises so many interesting ideas. So I have a few things to say in response to that. So I think first, one of the things that I do want to highlight, as you mentioned, is that I think maybe why so many historians of the East India Company are hesitant to talk about indirect rule is because it was such a complex and varied history. Because after all, like, there were hundreds of different polities, kingdoms that were bound to the company by unequal alliances, and each had its own history and its own unique trajectory, its own distinctive traits. Each had its own relationship with the company. So in some ways, you would actually have to write 500 books to capture all that. And there are, like, I really want to encourage anyone who reads my book, I would really want to encourage them to look into those regional histories, because there are experts who work on specific courts, and that would give a different perspective to what I've provided. But from the company's perspective, it's interesting because actually what they're trying to do is to systematize things. Like, they're trying to come up with a sort of system that they can apply everywhere. And so actually from their perspective, a lot of the rules and the principles and the ideas that are shaping what they're doing are the same. And that's really what I've tried to look at in the book. And that's the only reason why a single book is possible is because you're sort of focusing on, well, what was it that they were actually trying to do? But of course, the problem is that these ideas that they have to confront reality on the ground. They might have this ideal vision of what they want indirect rule to look like, but of course, the people that they encounter are not always going to be willing to help them to achieve these objectives. And so perhaps the most obvious challenge that they encounter is just outright resistance. people who do not welcome a British presence at court, people who simply want to eliminate them. So classic examples of this are just open rebellion and insurrection, but you also have assassination attempts on the resident as well, which are pretty common. These were not nice guys, so one can empathize, I guess. But then it gets a bit more complicated than that, because as you said, even before the residents arrive, these courts have their own factional politics. And so for some people, the resident coming is maybe like a weapon that they can use against their enemies. It's a way that they can pursue their own interests. It's something that they can use. So for them, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's just a reality that they then try and take into account when they're maneuvering at court. What's interesting is that from the company's perspective, these people are sometimes just as problematic as their outright enemies. Because there's always the danger that if people are trying to use you for their own purposes, you might not end up getting what you want, and your strategy might end up being derailed. So I think we'll talk about this a bit more, but this is something that is always happening. Is on the one hand, there's opposition, but then on the other hand, there's also like, maybe you're being manipulated in a way you don't even know. And that's something the residents are always afraid of. And so in some ways we might expect defiance at court. I think we would expect that the residents would face some opposition. But what's maybe less obvious, and what I also want to highlight, is that there's divisions within the company itself that make indirect rule kind of problematic. So there's these practical problems, but then there's also the problem that at this moment, people don't really have a clear idea of what indirect rule should be. They're trying to develop that idea. They're trying to come up with that idea, and people have different visions that they're trying to impose. And so far, I've tended to talk about the company as though it was one unitary thing, like the company, it did this, it did that. But of course, it's actually composed of all these individuals and all these different interests. And what's more, you've got divisions between executives in London, officials in Calcutta, the colonial capital. And then you've got the residents on the ground. I mean, they are all viewing things differently. And there's a lot of concern within the company because the residents are Europeans who are at these courts. So residents, I should say, that's the title that they used for their political agents. The residents might have one or two secretaries or assistants with them, but mostly they're on their own. They're unsupervised, and often at a great distance from Calcutta, let alone London. So there's no way of knowing what the residents are doing. You just have to trust in their letters and reports that they're writing exactly what they're getting up to. And so, of course, you have this distrust within the system where residents are doing something and the Governor General's like, well, maybe that's not good. And the residents like, well, I'm the expert. And they're kind of bickering back and forth with each other. And people in London view things completely differently. So where there's no trust, where you have these kind of difficult relationships, that's when maybe people start keeping information back. They're not being honest, they're misrepresenting. But it also creates these conditions of uncertainty where people don't know what to do. They don't know what's happening, or they don't know what they're even meant to be doing. And so in this context, things can go askew really quickly, and you can have problems emerge at court.
For those listening, like you briefly mentioned how there are executives in London, there's kind of the colonial officials in Calcutta, and there's the residents who are European officials essentially based at these courts across India. Just for those listening, could you just kind of briefly explain how that system works and what kind of each role does in that system?
Yeah, absolutely. So the company, it's sort of this weird organization because, as people will likely know, it is a trading company. It's a corporation, but it also has close connections with the British government itself. So to start in London, the company is a joint stock corporation, which means it has shareholders. So it's accountable to these shareholders. They're called proprietors. And among the proprietors, they elect what are called directors. So we can think of these as like corporate executives. These are people who are meant to represent the interests of the shareholders, but they also act as a kind of governing body for the company itself. Now, in the late 18th century, the British government starts to be like, maybe this is problematic. We've got this corporation that's raising armies. We're sending armies to fight on their behalf. Maybe actually we should be supervising this more closely. So there is what's called a board of control, and these are ministers. So this is part of government, and their role is to supervise what the company is doing and to kind of interact with the court of directors in this respect. And really what they're primarily interested in is things to do with like politics and diplomacy. So they're actually especially interested in the residents, and they are always very, very keen to keep track of whatever it is the residents are getting up to. Then once you're in India, so the Governor General is the highest official in India. People who are familiar with the Raj will be familiar with the figure of the Viceroy, and this is roughly the equivalent of that for the company period. And for those courts that were perceived to be really important, so for courts that were given a high priority, the Governor General would supervise those directly. So the Governor General would be directly interacting with the resident on the ground because politics in these spaces was seen to be so important. So that's actually how I selected the different courts that I focus on in my book. I focus on 6 political centers. And the reason why I chose them is because these are the ones that were selected out by the Governor General as courts that particularly needed to be watched over. Then you have the resident on the ground. That's the person who's really at the heart of the book. That's mostly who I focus on. And the resident will also have a varying number of like European secretaries and assistants. There will also sometimes be like military officers. So these are the people that the resident is primarily interacting with. But a lot of them, I mean, he effectively views them as employees. Often they're people who he's used patronage to bring them to court. Sometimes they're family members that he's trying to do a favor for. So we shouldn't really think of these people as potential counterpoints to the resident. I mean, there are a few cases of whistleblowers, but for the most part, these are people who kind of have obligations to the resident. The resident is basically their boss. So that's the dynamic that's existing at court. And then, of course, apart from that, you have this wider courtly population, the general population. You have all these Indian scribes and translators. We'll get into that later in the interview. But those are the Europeans that feature in the book anyway.
And then in terms of kind of the power in that system, like how much influence and power does the resident have? And like, are they literally a mouthpiece for the executive sitting in London, or are they like, and how much influence do they have in the courts that they're in? Like, can they kind of snap their fingers and things change, or is it a long kind of process?
That is really, so that's a really interesting question. And the answer is that it varies quite a lot. So I would say in general, during this period, the residents do have quite a lot of power, generally. Like if I were to make a general statement for all the residents that I look at. And that's really because at this period, the company is fighting a series of wars where it's showing that actually they are kind of the dominant military power in the subcontinent. So the very fact that the resident has this military backing means that actually his words have a lot of weight. But it can vary a bit depending on personality. So some of the residents, it's interesting. Some of them come from aristocratic backgrounds. Some of them have high connections within the company, and that actually increases their status both at court and within the company itself. So I mentioned that there are divisions generally between the Governor General and the resident, but there are a few examples of the residents actually giving advice to the Governor General. So some of them are actually pretty influential within the company itself. They're sort of seen as experts, and they're seen as sort of natural political leaders as well. Many of them would go on to some would become governors in India, some would become MPs on their return to Britain. So you have a few of these like sort of celebrities that emerge. In other cases, you have residents who aren't so successful, and it's kind of interesting. Like there are a few residents who are seen as softies. They're seen as maybe not having the sort of what the British see as maybe like the appropriate amount of authority they maybe give in too easily. So there are a few residents who are more inclined to a strategy of conciliation, of trying to make friends. And then in that case, maybe they don't exercise influence in the same way that others might. So there is a certain amount of ideological difference as well as personality difference that shapes how residents behave at these courts.
You mentioned how these residents have varying kind of degrees of influence, but generally they are quite influential in terms of how things unfold. How does the financial side of things work? Because obviously we're not at a point where you've got where it becomes like the nabobs and like everyone's going over to get filthy rich and then come back and it becomes a big issue in parliament and whatever. We're not obviously at that stage yet, but like, is there, like, how does the finance side of things work? Because I'm sure there's some type of financial extraction occurring, because obviously this is what the empire is based on, but how does it work? And like, are there disputes or controversies or kind of, I don't know, like dirty dealings that, as in you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
someone
There's definitely dirty
whistleblowing.
dealings.
Yeah. So what is going on in with all of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think in a lot of the historical scholarship and also at the time, people tended to view the 18th century as sort of the high point of corruption in India, as the time of like nabobs, as you were saying. But that's definitely still very much going on. That's more of like an aspiration. There's kind of this idea that they've rooted out corruption, but that's not a reality. And as historians, looking back over 200 years, it's really hard to know how much dirty dealing, as you said, was happening, because obviously there's an interest in keeping these things secret. Like, the whole point is that you're on the take and you don't want people to know about it. In a few private letters and diaries, we do have evidence that proves that people were accepting gifts. So, like, for example, in some of their letters and diaries, residents will say, the minister slipped a diamond into my pocket. That's a really common one. Secretly just slip in a little diamond or offer a
Oh
land.
wow, yeah, like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, look what I
Oh,
found, right? Yeah.
how kind of you.
Yeah.
So like you do see that. I mean, the biggest giveaway of all, and this is something the company are actually very aware of, is that the residents aren't actually paid that big of a salary because they're also giving living expenses. So if a resident comes back to Britain and he has a load of money, that is that is really suspicious. And you certainly have quite a few residents who are doing that, who are coming back to Britain and buying big manor houses, decorating them lavishly. I mean, it's a dead giveaway, but it's really hard to know because basically you're dependent on like the accounting and the records that they keep. And they're never going to give you those papers, of course. And so there are a few corruption scandals in the early 19th century where it's just so obvious that even it becomes very difficult for the company's government itself to ignore it. I mentioned the allowances that residents get. I mean, that's another big issue. So the residents are regarded as kind of the physical embodiment of the company at these courts. They like physically represent the company's authority. And so that means that they need to be dressed really nicely. They need to go around in fancy carriages. They need to live in the best houses. If they don't live in the best houses in the city, then it makes the company look weak. It makes them look poor, like they don't have the same financial resources. And so early in the residency's history, that starts becoming a problem because the residents at first weren't meant to be as showy as they became. And so a lot of the first residency buildings that were constructed were relatively plain and humble. And so in the early 19th century, there starts being this program of building where they're like, okay, we need to actually have the nicest building in the city. But of course, from the perspective of London and Calcutta, it looks suspicious. Because it's like, yeah, okay, you can argue that this is part of diplomacy. You can argue that you need to look good, that you need to host dinners and all that. But what are your motivations really? Because after all, many of these men are explicit, they're there on a job. They are there in India in the first place to make their fortunes. And you can only rely on what they tell you when it comes to how they're spending their allowances. So what you see during this period is residents being, I need a bigger allowance, I need a bigger allowance, I need this carriage, I need this elephant, I need this thing. And the company are like, well, but do you actually need that? Or are you just saying that? So again, like I'll keep emphasizing again and again, but there's this distrust that's rife within the system because of the distances that are separating people, but also because it's recognized that this is kind of an exploitative situation that the residents can take advantage of for their own personal gain.
How is it just the fact that it's personal gain that the corruption is an issue? Because to me, it almost seems like there being a problem with corruption is just a paradox in and of itself, because empire is, to some degree, just a hugely corrupt system. So you've then got these people arguing amongst themselves, but is that just because of the fact that this resident or whoever it might be is gaining for themselves rather than for the company or for some greater collective?
Yeah, so I think that's really it. I think it varies on the court. Some courts are wealthier than others. Like there are a few courts during this period that are actually pretty prosperous, even despite their relationship with the company. But I think one of the fears is that if you let the residents kind of extract too much for themselves personally, it will mean that these courts are not able to pay their subsidies. And it will mean that these courts are not actually kind of sustainable politically. And so I think that is the concern. I feel like there's a certain willingness to maybe turn a blind eye if it doesn't go beyond a certain point. But really, there is a point in which it actually starts undermining what the company is trying to do. And I think there's also a concern as well, like socially and politically, in terms of the relationships that you build at court. On the one hand, I think there's a concern that it will give the company a bad reputation, obviously, make them look bad. But I think also maybe what they're afraid of is that actually the resident is building their own sphere of influence and their own sphere of control that the company can't actually use for themselves. And this is where it becomes kind of complicated, because it's really easy to dismiss gift giving as bribery. And there's definitely some bribery that's happening. But there's also gift giving that's just gift giving. That is literally relationships being built through exchanges. You know, residents will be like, oh, you know, this ruler is really interested in mechanical clocks. Let me collect some mechanical clocks. Like, playing to each other's tastes, giving hunting rifles and horses and things like this. Like these are building relationships. But from the company's perspective, even if that's not corruption, it's also still concerning, because you wonder about if the resident is building this influence at court, what is he using it for? And I think as well, it's interesting as well, like the early 19th century is a turning point in so many ways, because the British are also starting to question, should we actually be assimilating to Indian courts? Like, should we be trying to fit in? Should we be adopting Indian lifestyles? Like, aren't we meant to be superior? You know, increasingly they are having that idea, and it's partly coming out of the conquests that they're engaging in India. That's partly what's feeding into this. But this is also a moment of evangelical revival as well. So there's a sense of, as Christian people, aren't we meant to be behaving in a Christian way? And interestingly, they don't apply that argument so much to the violence part, which we might expect. But instead, it's really about lifestyles. And it's really about, okay, this sort of stereotype of Indian luxury and this fear of the moral effects that it might have if we actually allow residents to behave in this way. So one of the things I argue in my book is the financial disputes. There's kind of this practical dimension to it. There's this personal dimension to it. But there's also this sort of like moral dimension to it, and this fear of what happens to British people when they're not in Britain anymore. What happens, especially to residents, because like they don't have, you know, they have their employees. There are a few European employees around them, but they're not really surrounded by a European society that can kind of hold them to account. So how are they going to behave, and what are they going to do? That's one of the problems that the residency is seen to pose for the company.
how did then I guess it would be resident attitudes as well, but how did British attitudes and concerns towards local Indian figures like Munchies, etc. Um, like as in Elphinstone expresses a particular opinion on them, and like how does that influence kind of British interactions and the functioning of how the East India Company is ruling?
Yeah, Elphinstone. I mean, he's kind of the worst. Like it's interesting. Like a lot of these residents are a bit unsavory in some of their views, but even by that standard, perhaps it's because we have his diaries. So the residents left different kinds of evidence for us, and Elphinstone was one of these people who wrote a lot, and we have his personal journals. And of course, in these journals, he expresses things that I don't think he would have expressed in letters, because he's keeping these journals for a different purpose. I mean, in some ways, he's actually keeping these journals. He's sort of beating himself up in a way for what a bad guy he is in his journals. That's sort of the purpose that journals serve, as self-reflection. So he does have, he's one of these people who doesn't really enjoy being at Indian courts. He likes being a resident because he likes the authority that he has, but he doesn't actually enjoy socializing with the Marathas. He's mostly stationed at Maratha courts. And he has this stereotype that Indians are like deceitful. And this is a really like, this stereotype is just everywhere. It's something that a lot of British people believe, and him in particular. So he expresses these views. I mean, it's interesting because actually, like, he's quite well known as a historian and a Persian scholar. So he's very interested in studying India and writing about India and collecting information about India. He's one of these classic gentleman scholars. But he often expresses the view that, like, he doesn't want Indians, especially Indian employees, he doesn't want them to sit at the table with him. And in some of his letters, he expresses sort of maybe derision or contempt for residents who do socialize with their Indian employees in this way. But of course, he's reliant on these people as well. And that, again, it's these paradoxes that keep coming up because he has these views of Indians like they're deceitful, they can't be trusted, you know, you have to keep an eye on them. But then at the same time, indirect rule can only work if you rely on people, like you need to work with them. And so how do you strike that balance? And again, that's one of the things that residents really struggle with. For some residents, it's easier than others, but a lot of them, they have to rely on translators, on scribes and accountants, but they just don't trust them at all. And that's like a definite issue.
One part of the book that definitely got my interest, and this is probably one of the most exciting questions for me to ask, just because of like I have no idea about it, and it's always interesting to find out more. But the East India Company's practices of surveillance and control. Like, first of all, I wanted to ask, what is going on? Like, what are these practices? But then secondly, how do they evolve and get exported around the globe?
So yeah, it's one of the residents' most important responsibilities. And we talked earlier about how indirect rule changes over time. We mentioned the sort of financial dimension. This information gathering dimension is also something that becomes really important really quickly. And so in terms of how it works, it becomes more sophisticated over time because really what it relies upon is the resident actually having a network of spies. So they develop a network of paid informants. These are different kinds of people. Quite often it's people that you wouldn't expect, people who can move from place to place without really being noticed. So like religious pilgrims are one, like messengers, merchants. And what they're primarily being used for is to especially like follow armies around to report on troop movements and military preparations. But the residents are also spying on political elites. So they are, at certain points, just employing people to, like, follow the ruler around. So at Pune, the ruler complained that, like, he couldn't have a meal, he couldn't even eat without the resident knowing what was on the menu. But I think what makes this process so insidious and so powerful is that once they've collected this information, the residents exchange it across the subcontinent. So they send it to Calcutta, but they also send it to other residents. So everyone knows what's going on in every other place. And the reason why this is important is because at the same time, the company are also trying to isolate Indian courts. So the idea is that the company will have this information network that will span South Asia, but these courts, by contrast, are supposed to not know anything at all of what is going on. But I mean, here I have to say that, like, as with everything else, it works, but there are also kind of cracks in the structure that they build. Information still manages to leak through. They can never stop information from circulating entirely. And again, it's, as I mentioned, they themselves are reliant on merchants and pilgrims, all these mobile people moving and collecting information. I mean, those people themselves, they're also talking, they're also spreading information. They can't control everyone and everything that is said. And so you have these really embarrassing situations where a ruler will ask the resident, so I heard this, can you confirm or deny? And it'll be true, but it's something the resident doesn't want them to know. And so they're put in this really awkward position. Like, that happens again and again. And there's also the fact that, like, again, relating to rumors can become really complicated. Like, there are people who try and use the company's information networks against them. So we talk about misinformation and disinformation today. That was a real issue for the company because people were trying to deceive them explicitly. And sometimes this would be rival states, like especially when they were at war, it was really common for false rumors of like numbers of troops or troop movements or things like this. Like, these rumors are always being circulated. Rumors like, oh, the company's been defeated in this place, they've been outnumbered, or these people are forming a coalition, like these different rumors that the company was under threat. And it was really hard for the company to know what to do about things like this because you don't want to base your whole policy and your whole strategy on something that could end up being false. You know, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But then on the other hand, even rumors that aren't true, they can have effects. And so sometimes there would be these rumors that had no basis in fact, but actually they could inspire rebellions. They could inspire disaffection. They could really like undermine the company politically because they would make the company seem weak, or they would make people think, okay, actually, maybe we have a chance to eliminate the company's presence here. And so there's this really tricky balance where they have to try and find a way of dealing with stuff without necessarily maybe letting these things derail their plans. And if you add on to that the fact that, you know, so I've sort of talked about like rival kingdoms trying to feed disinformation, but there's also this issue of these paid informants, these spies that I've described. They get money for information that they sell to the company. You know, some of them are on a salary, but a lot of them are just, you know, coming to them, presenting them with intercepted letters or something like that, and being paid for it. That's a financial incentive to present information. You could make that up. And people do. Like, there are examples of people presenting letters to the company and being like, here's a letter that I intercepted. You may want to look at this. And it's obviously forged. And so, you know, that's, again, an example of people kind of turning the company's information networks against them. And so they work. I don't want to kind of underplay the significance of the company's information networks because it's really crucial to how they're able to exercise control. But it's just like, it's never easy. Just nothing the company tries to do is ever easy, and everything is complicated. Everything is resisted, and that applies to this kind of surveillance as well.
You mentioned the fear of rebellion, and something that I wanted to ask you was, how does the British perceived fear of a rebellion help influence their strategy during this period and their form of rule? Because it's almost as though they think there's going to be a rebellion at any second, just all the time. They're almost just like, oh, everyone's going to like just rebel just constantly. What's going on there? But then also, how does it influence the strategy that the British, well, in particular the East India Company, are deploying at this point?
Yeah, so a really interesting feature of life at the residencies, it's almost like it's an interesting sort of psychological thing to observe, but they know they're not doing a good thing. Like they really they recognize that it is exploitative. And once you recognize that, you become very alert to the fact that, okay, maybe I'm not wanted here. And as I said, some of the residents actually form fairly good relationships. Like some of them maybe fit in a bit better than others, but it's impossible for them to ignore the fact that actually, like, they are there as a person, trying to impose control that is not welcome. And so, as I said, like, many of them face assassination attempts, threats on their life. That happens. And that's especially prevalent during this period because it's one where it's becoming clear by the turn of the 19th century that the East India Company have a kind of military supremacy. At the same time, resistance is still happening everywhere. They're fighting wars. There's a lot of unrest. And then you've got the French in the background. Like the British are fighting this global war against the French as well. That's kind of in people's minds. And so in this context, the residents don't feel very secure. They don't feel like they're wanted. They feel under threat. And they also are very aware that they are a small group of Europeans surrounded by a large number of Indians. So basically what that creates is this sense of being under siege, this idea that an attack could happen at any moment. Like some of the residents explicitly say, I'm surrounded by enemies. That's how they see it. And so here again, this idea of the use of force comes into play because they're like, in their mind, they think, I'm never going to be popular just up myself. People are inherently not going to like what I'm trying to do because explicitly I'm trying to curtail their independence. The only way that I can keep myself secure and do what I need to do is just be prepared to defend myself if I need to, and be as threatening as possible. So yeah, again, it's the presence of large armies. Residents feel really uncomfortable if they don't have large armies nearby. Not all the residencies have armies stationed around them. It depends on the terms of the treaty. And those that don't, they're always like, I would really like an army. Please, like, that would be so much better. They like that. This is really an important way that they see of trying to keep themselves secure and maintain their influence.
Are any of the residents assassinated? You mentioned there were some attempts, but are any of them actually?
Not during this period. No, it's just something they're worried about. There's like, and again, the rumors come into play because some of the more unpopular residents, there's always rumors that they're going to be assassinated, and then they're like, is this just an intimidation tactic? Like they don't know. Could it be real? And then there are some poisoning attempts. There are some insurrections and cases of residents having to escape. The only person that actually gets assassinated at this point is like an assistant to the resident. That does happen at Delhi. But again, there's been some really interesting scholarship on this, but like attacks on the resident. Oh, there's another one at Delhi as well. There's a few attacks at Delhi. But like the company tends to strip that of its politics. That's one of the sort of strategies that they use to downplay opposition. So they'll often, these assaults that happen on the resident or the resident staff, they'll say, oh, it was, this was a person who was mentally unwell. This was a person who was maybe a religious fanatic. They'll use those terms and that language to say this was not a political act, because the last thing they want is to create the impression that like the resident could actually be threatened or that there could actually be some kind of larger political opposition to the resident. Yeah.
One key theme that I wanted to ask you about, and we haven't touched upon it yet, which is obviously this indirect rule is built upon the use and threat of violence. But how does punishment fit into this, and how does the threat of punishment work?
So this is a really interesting one because, again, it comes into this sort of ambivalent position that the residents occupy at court, because actually they're not supposed to intervene in the justice system in any way. Like that's part of the internal administration. So that is not their purview. But they will do so if something is seen as like a direct transgression against them. They will intervene. So examples of this will include, like, for example, the residency has its own marketplace. If someone robs that marketplace, if someone attacks the resident, If someone like, it's pretty common for people at the time to try and like turn the company's troops against them because most of the company's troops like are Indian soldiers. So, um, and so if any of these things happen, that's seen as something personal to the resident, as a direct attack on him. And in that case, he is very concerned to make an example. And it's quite shocking to read now because they use this language of like spectacular violence, of a spectacle of violence. And it ties back to what we were talking about the residents feeling themselves to be under threat because they see people generally as hostile to them. Every time someone actually does act out against them, they want to make a really severe example of that person because they want to do everything they can to deter anyone else from following their example. And so there's a few different ways that they try to do this. Flogging is one, hanging is one. But often their preferred tactic is to shoot the person from a cannon. Yeah, and this is there's a few reasons for this. Probably the most important reason why they choose to do this is because this is also a form of discipline that was used previously by a lot of these Indian states and continues to be used. So in some sense, in their mind, it has a kind of legitimacy. It's something they can do that's really violent, but they also see it as legitimate because they're not the ones to introduce it. So it sort of has that dimension to it. It's also seen to be especially scary. And finally, interestingly, they argue for it on humanitarian grounds, which is just crazy to us to think about. But they actually argue that it's like a less painful way to die than a hanging.
I guess it makes sense in some degree. Like, you ain't going to realize that the middle of your body's been blown out. But yeah, like, fair enough.
Yeah, so it's awful. And really, it's predominantly used against rebels. So these other things that I've described, like floggings and hangings, that might be for other kinds of crimes. But blowing from a cannon is really reserved for people who try armed rebellion against the resident or against the company.
Just getting to the last few questions there, these are mainly based with how the resident and the East India Company are actually interacting and kind of dealing with some of the, I guess, unique characteristics of India and these courts, which is like, so just the dynamics of kinship, gender, and then succession within these princely states. Obviously, there's certain examples that you talk about in your book where the resident influences kind of the ideas of legitimacy in terms of kind of succession. And then equally, obviously, I think anyone who's listened to the podcast for some time would probably get an idea that the role of women in these spaces is a lot different to how we would understand them today, but equally drastically different to what the British would have understood when they turned up. So I guess I've kind of rolled everything into one there, but so how, I guess we could start off with like, how did they first navigate just these differences, kinship, gender, succession? Like, how did they, or are they just like, forget it, we're just gonna kind of bulldoze it and we're gonna go with what we think?
A bit of both. So to sort of provide a bit of context for people who maybe aren't as familiar with these courts, at many of the courts that I examine in the book, there's a few things that are at work here that make family a bit complicated. So rulers will have multiple wives, and then also not just wives, but also concubines and slaves, and who is a wife and who is a slave can actually, again, the lines are really blurred. And so from the resident's perspective, there's just all these women and all these children and large numbers, like hundreds, and keeping them all straight, they often really struggle. So some of the residents actually keep little like handbooks explaining who is who and how they're all related, just so they can keep track, and they'll send this to the Governor General as well. So a big part of it is just literally trying to keep track who's related to who's married to who, because these things are politically important. Factions tend to fall along lines of marriage and family. So if you know who is marrying who, then that often gives you some insight. Okay, like these people are kind of forming some kind of political party at court. These people are maybe another. So they do need to pay attention to how these families are structured. But at the same time, as you say, obviously for them, the easiest way is to bulldoze it and is to try to impose their own rules. And this is especially true of succession because so historically, you would have these different wives, you would have these different sons, you would have a bunch of uncles and male relatives. And normally the ruler would sort of select the person that they wanted to be their heir. So they would mark out someone that they wanted to succeed them. And usually they do so by giving them a lot of experience, giving them different offices, giving them roles so that they would be ready to become ruler, but also so that people would recognize them as having some kind of authority. But that being said, it was possible to contest this. Like really, the succession just went to whoever was the strongest. I mean, in some ways, it could be violent, but it was also a vibrant system because it meant that brothers, nephews, and uncles, they're competing, and whoever is the strongest, that is the person who would often end up emerging in control. Obviously, the last thing the company wants really is a strong monarchy. I mean, they want one that's effective, but they don't actually want one that can threaten them. And they also don't want a process that they themselves can't control. So they don't want the uncertainty of waiting and seeing who will emerge as the strongest. So what they do instead is they try and impose a system of primogeniture, which is how things work in Europe, which is just like the oldest son always succeeds. It's just the oldest legitimate son, that is always the person who will succeed. I mean, as you could guess, younger brothers at Indian courts do not love this system at all. And so quite often what you have is younger brothers who are just like really disaffected and disenfranchised, really angry because they see this sort of alternative future for themselves that they could maybe have had if the resident weren't there, if things were different. And so it is sad. You see these people who, under different circumstances, maybe they were really well suited to take on that leadership role. And then in the end, they're just stifled. And so quite often at court, it's these young men who are often guilty of attacking the resident. I mean, sometimes it's just out of frustration. Like sometimes it seems like literally they're just getting drunk and going and attacking and just getting angry. But sometimes it's more of an organized rebellion. But either way, that's a problem. That's a problem the company has to resolve. That being said, there's also ways to use it to their advantage because given this context of rivalry between male siblings, sometimes the company can use that to then form alliances because rulers tend to regard their male relatives as a kind of political threat. They're usually really suspicious of them. So it's not that uncommon at many of these courts for rulers to keep their male relatives basically under house arrest, at least under surveillance. And sometimes even, like their lives might be at risk. And so for these younger brothers or male cousins or whatever the case might be, the company is seen as a protector. And some of them sell information to the company just to ingratiate themselves. Some of them actually ask to go and live in company territory. So they ask to leave court and to go live usually at religious centers, somewhere where they feel a bit more safe. So there is kind of an interesting dynamic there. I mean, this applies to royal relatives in general. Like the royals can either be the residents' greatest allies or their greatest enemies. And it's often just one or the other. And that can apply to royal women as well. I don't know if that's something you want me to talk about right now, but
no, please go ahead, carry on.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, you've got all these women at court, and the thing is, I mean, this is where sort of the space of the court itself actually becomes important, and this is where it's maybe somewhat different from European courts, because at a lot of the Indian courts that I study, and this is true of courts around the world actually, non-European courts in many cases, like the ruler spends a lot of time in his private quarters with the women of his family, with his children. And this is a place that's where there's restricted access. So the residents aren't actually welcome there, which is maybe part of their appeal. All of the residents complain, all the ruler spends all his time in the zenana in the women's quarters, and it's like, well, maybe he's just trying to avoid you. But so these are kind of family and social spaces, but they're also political spaces because this is where the ruler reads his correspondence. This is where he makes a lot of his decisions. I mean, certain men who are sort of intimate with the ruler or who are friends with him will be allowed into these spaces. So all this means that actually women are at the center of power. They've got a relationship with the ruler, especially like older women. So the ruler's mother in particular can often be a really important figure who has influence over him. They have access to all this privileged information. They know everything that's going on at court. And it's also important to note that a lot of these women, they have their own symbolic power. Like they're also part of the royal bloodline, even apart from the ruler. They're sort of they sort of take authority from just being part of the family. But also they have their own wealth and resources. They conduct trade. They have territories of their own. Some of them raise armies, like just in their own right. They essentially they have money and they can use that money to build influence. And so you have royal women who are really important political players at court, really important. And it's interesting, like from the resident's perspective, as you say, in some ways this doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite fit with what the residents would like to see. And they often use a sort of sexualizing language to talk about these women, like maybe they're loose women or inappropriate women. But it's interesting because actually, like, women are very active in British politics too, in a similar way, kind of behind the scenes, bringing people together, forming connections. And so residents do recognize the power that Indian women can have in this situation, and they want to use that to their advantage. But if they want to use that influence, then they have to pay for it, basically. Like they have to offer concrete benefits. There has to be some advantage to this association. And so in the records of the residency, what we see is actually the residents performing a lot of services for royal women, just trying to build a good relationship, trying to ingratiate them. They'll do things like, allow them to conduct duty-free trade or help them to collect tax or facilitate religious pilgrimages or, just doing all these different things that they think might help. And partly they're kind of hoping that these royal women will influence the ruler on their behalf. So there's kind of this perception that maybe like royal women might have a sort of softening influence, that they can kind of like smooth out any tensions that might exist, maybe like control their sons, prevent their sons from being too erratic. But it's also kind of this idea that women have influence across the broader court, and whatever these women do, then others might follow. And again, it sort of ties in as well. We had talked about how the residents are always trying to play off of divisions at court, and the same is true here. Because of course women have enemies of their own. Sometimes the resident is not the biggest threat, and the resident can actually be a kind of protection against other threats. Some royal women don't have great relationships with the ruler. This is especially true, for example, like as I mentioned, rulers will have multiple wives. Their successor will kind of give certain advantages to their own mother, but in terms of like their sort of stepmothers, I guess you could call them, or the other women of the household, those women will sometimes have really difficult relationships with the new ruler. And so the company is a way for them to, especially to protect their wealth, to make sure that none of their money gets appropriated by the ruler, and also to make sure that when they die, any wealth that they have passes on to their own servants and dependents within their own circle of influence. So again, it's about money and the services that you can provide. And so I think we really need to remember that people are just doing what seems best to them in the moment based on the constraints that they're facing. And so there are so many examples of royal women who are initially resistant to the company, who even rebel directly against them, but then make strategic alliances because, let's say there's a regime change, there's a new ruler, whatever, circumstances change, and then the company starts seeming actually like a good ally. And so it's just a case of people really trying to do what they need to do to survive or for their own prosperity or for their own advantage, whatever it is. And the company is always trying to exploit this. And that's really the history of indirect rule in a nutshell.
Oh, there's just my last question then, and this is just slightly more lighthearted. But if you could go back in time and talk to anyone that you studied about, well, I guess anything actually, who would it be, and what would you talk to them about?
So I have to admit that I'd watched some of your other episodes, so I had an idea this question might be coming, and I thought about it. The problem for me is that a lot of the residents are really unsavory, so it definitely wouldn't be one of them. They're not nice guys. But I did immediately have one person who jumped to mind, which is I mentioned just now a royal woman who started out by rebelling against the company and then ended up forming an alliance with them. And that's Bahu Begum, she's just this really fascinating person who her lifespan basically covered the emergence of the British as the paramount power. So she was there supporting her husband when he was trying to sort of resist the company's incursions in the mid-18th century. She was there when the first residents were established. She tried to organize a rebellion against them, and then her son ended up becoming ruler himself. She had to support him. Then her brother-in-law, who she hated, became ruler. She had to ally with the company so it's just like she had to endure so many changes and had to sort of adjust her position depending on what was going on. And so I just think she would have such fascinating stories to tell about living through what was truly a really tumultuous period and being such an important person in the history of this court, in the history of Awad, in the history of Lucknow as well. So it would be her. But in general, I just think all the royal women would make for amazing dinner party guests. Because as I've said, they know everything that is going on in the palace. They have all the sordid details and they're so well connected. I just feel like, there would be a lot of juicy gossip, but also a lot of really interesting political insights too. And the residents would not be allowed because it would be in the Zenata.
I like that answer. I just wanted to double check. I've got to the end of all the questions that I had planned to go over. But I just wanted to make sure, is there anything that you feel like we should mention or haven't included or anything in particular?
Well, I think I've mentioned this a bit through the interview, but I just want to highlight that this is just a starting point for indirect rule and for understanding it. And I really hope that people who read the book and liked it will just dig in deeper and dig into these regional histories, read all these different authors who have worked on this topic. There's not a lot, but there's more and more all the time that's being published. And so I just want to make sure that I'm doing justice to the variety that exists out there, the regional expertise that exists. There's a lot. And also just to the fact that every story is always more complicated than it at first appears. And so I've tried to sift out what I see as the key themes. But all the residents are individuals. Each court had a different experience. For everything that I've said, an expert on this topic could probably think of a counterexample. Even I could think of a counterexample. So I would just say that if you're interested in the topic, there's so much more to explore. So just take this as the starting point and learn more.
No, definitely. Thank you. I can only just say thank you for spending the last hour or so. Well, it's almost been an hour and a half actually. Discussing this. I've enjoyed it a lot. I hope everyone listening to it has enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you so much. And that's the end of another intriguing podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating this podcast. If you're passionate about the work I'm doing and want to support it, consider becoming a paid YouTube member to unlock some cool features or join our Patreon community. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!